Promises meant nothing when winter came to the Highlands. Melissa learned that the day Kaelin traded their 10-year bond for a dowry of silver and a politically convenient bride. He told her it was for the good of the pack. She told him to choke on it. Now, as encroaching savage clans tear through the borders, he's about to learn that the loyalty he discarded was the only thing keeping him alive, and the ruthless Alpha King he fears is the man willing to burn the world down to keep her safe. Frost clung to the iron-wrought handles of the washtubs, biting through Melissa's calloused skin. She scrubbed the coarse wool of the guards' cloaks until her knuckles bled, watching the red swirl into the grey, soapy water. It was a rhythmic, mindless task. Exactly what she needed. Up in the main keep fires roared in hearths the size of small cabins. Spit-roasted venison dripped fat into the embers, and the scent of spiced wine drifted down to the lower bailey, mocking the cold. Kaelin was up there. Beatrice was up there. 10 years of shared survival, of fighting back-to-back in the mud, of building a pack out of starvation and sheer spite, erased by a single diplomatic trip to the Southern Territories. Kaelin had left as a struggling alpha trying to secure a grain trade. He returned with a new mate, a woman whose father controlled 3 ports and an army of purebred enforcers. Melissa didn't scream when he told her. She didn't fall to her knees. She had simply stared at the man. She thought she knew a man whose face held the distinct cowardly tightness of someone trying to justify a betrayal as a tactical necessity. "She brings grain, Melissa. She brings steel." Kaelin had said, his voice dropping into that placating timbre he used on frightened pups. "Our people won't starve. Our people were doing just fine," Melissa had replied, turning her back on him. She packed her few belongings before the sun set. She didn't leave the pack. She had bled for this land, and she refused to be chased off it, but she descended from the Alpha's quarters to the serf's ward. Let him have his rich Luna. Let him sleep in silk while she slept on straw. Now, 3 months later, the reality of his choice permeated the pack's daily life. Beatrice Langdon was not a wolf of the woods. She was a creature of ballrooms and manicured courtyards. She complained of the Highland damp. She insisted the pack's elite guard wear ceremonial armor that hindered their movement. She decorated the Great Hall with imported tapestries, while the border patrols went without proper boots. Kaelin accommodated every whim, terrified of offending his wealthy father-in-law. Melissa wrung out a heavy cloak, tossing it onto the drying rack. A sharp cough rattled her chest. The damp was settling deep into her lungs. "You're working yourself to the bone again, Melissa," a gruff voice called out. Bran, an old grizzled warrior with a missing left ear, limped into the courtyard. He dropped a bundle of split firewood near her station. "Idle hands make for a wandering mind, Bran." Melissa said, not looking up. She plunged the next dirt-caked tunic into the freezing water. "The king's banners were spotted past the ridge," Bran murmured, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "Gideon Cross himself, riding with a vanguard of 50 heavy cavalry." Melissa paused. The icy water lapped against her wrists. The Alpha King rarely left the capital, let alone ventured into the brutal northern highlands as winter set in. Gideon Cross was a warlord who had united the territories through a terrifying mix of tactical brilliance and sheer unadulterated violence. He wasn't a politician. He was a survivor who had conquered his way to the top. "Why is he here?" she asked, wiping a strand of damp, dark hair from her forehead. "The northern passes are failing," Bran said grimly. "The wild clans are organizing. Rogues are banding together, hitting the outer villages. The king is doing a tour of the border fortresses. He wants to see if our defenses hold." Melissa scoffed a harsh sound that scraped her dry throat. "Kaelin has spent the last month replacing our spiked barricades with ornamental ironwork to please Beatrice. The king is going to string him up by his entrails. Perhaps," Bran agreed, a dark amusement in his remaining eye. "But Kaelin has ordered the entire pack to the courtyard to receive him, including you. Wash the blood off your hands, Melissa. The king arrives at noon." Melissa looked down at her battered hands. They were raw, split, and embedded with dirt. They were the hands of a worker, a fighter. Beatrice's hands were soft, scented with rosewater. She dried her hands on her coarse apron. She had no fine dresses. She had only her work tunics and her leather hunting trousers. She wouldn't pretend to be anything she wasn't. Let Cailan parade his painted wife before the king. Melissa would stand in the dirt where she belonged and watch the mighty Alpha of the North try to explain why his fortress smelled like a brothel instead of a garrison. The earth trembled before the royal vanguard even came into view. The heavy rhythmic thud of armored destriers struck the frozen ground like a slow-beating drum. Melissa stood in the back rows of the pack, flanked by the butchers, the tanners, and the laundresses. The air was thick with the nervous scent of her packmates. Up at the front, standing on the stone steps of the keep, Cailan puffed out his chest. He wore a velvet doublet lined with fox fur. Beside him, Beatrice shivered in a gown of thin emerald silk, clutching a sable cloak tight around her shoulders. She looked exquisite. She looked entirely useless for a siege. The heavy iron gates groaned open. Gideon Cross did not ride a majestic white stallion. He rode a massive scarred roan war-horse that looked as ill-tempered as its master. The king wore blackened steel armor, battered and dented from actual combat, not polished for parade. A thick wolf-pelt mantle draped over his broad shoulders, dusted with snow. He pulled back on the reins, halting his mount. His eyes, the color of crushed slate, swept over the courtyard. There was no warmth in them, no diplomatic softness. It was the gaze of a predator sizing up a cage. Cailan stepped forward, bowing deeply. Beatrice offered a perfect, practiced curtsy. "Your Majesty." Cailan projected his voice echoing off the stone walls. "The Northern Reach welcomes you. Our hearths are yours. Our meat is yours." Gideon stared down at him for a long, agonizing moment. He didn't dismount immediately. He looked at Cailan's velvet coat, then at Beatrice's silk gown. He looked at the ornamental ironwork that had replaced the defensive spikes. "Your perimeter is weak." Alpha Row. Gideon's voice was a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. It wasn't a greeting. It was an indictment. "I saw 3 blind spots on the western ridge, and your sentries are using damp wood for their watchfires. They are broadcasting their position to every rogue within 10 miles. Cailan's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse. "My king, the recent storms—" "I don't deal in weather. I deal in war." Gideon interrupted, finally swinging down from his horse. The heavy thud of his boots hitting the ground sent a subtle flinch through Cailan. Gideon tossed his reins to a royal guard and began walking through the ranks of the pack. He ignored the nobility. He ignored the wealthy merchants Beatrice had brought with her. He walked right past them, his slate eyes scanning the people who actually kept the keep running. Melissa stood still. She didn't lower her eyes like the others. She watched him. Up close, the Alpha King was intimidatingly large, a sheer mountain of muscle and scarred flesh. A jagged line ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pulling the skin tight. He smelled of rain, old iron, and ozone. He stopped a few feet from where Melissa stood. His gaze flicked to her hands, noting the raw, bleeding knuckles and the calluses. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Melissa held his gaze. She felt the heavy, suffocating pressure of his alpha aura, the instinctual command that forced lesser wolves to their knees. Her knees trembled, but she locked her joints. She was done bowing to men who thought they owned her. Gideon's expression didn't change, but a subtle shift occurred in his posture. The predatory tension eased just a fraction. He studied the stubborn tilt of her chin, the cynicism etched into the corners of her mouth, and the lack of fear in her eyes. He didn't speak. He simply held her gaze for 3 long seconds, an eternity in wolf language. It was an acknowledgement. Then he turned back to Cailan, who was practically sweating through his velvet. "Show me your armory row," Gideon commanded, and have your Luna put on a heavier coat before she freezes to death on my doorstep. I have no patience for funerals." Beatrice gasped, her pale cheeks flooding with colour. Cailan rushed to appease the king, his voice a frantic string of agreements as he led the royal entourage toward the keep. The courtyard slowly exhaled. Melissa stayed where she was, her heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at her raw hands. The cold air suddenly felt entirely different. That night, the great hall was stifling. Beatrice had insisted on doubling the hearth fires, turning the room into an oppressive oven. The tables groaned under the weight of excessive food, stuffed pheasants, sugared plums, whole roasted boars. It was a grotesque display of wealth meant to impress a king who clearly despised it. Melissa was drafted into the kitchens to help serve the lower tables. She carried heavy pitchers of ale weaving through the crowded, boisterous hall. The noise was deafening. Cailan sat at the high table laughing too loudly at his own jokes, while Beatrice tried desperately to engage the king in conversation about southern court politics. Gideon looked profoundly bored. He sat straight-backed in his heavy wooden chair, a cup of unspiced ale in his hand. He hadn't touched the sugared plums. Melissa approached a table near the dais, refilling the cups of the royal guards. They were quiet, disciplined men who watched the room with tactical precision. As she leaned over to pour, a drunken packmate stumbled backward, slamming into her shoulder. The heavy clay pitcher slipped. Melissa twisted, sacrificing her own balance to catch it before it shattered. She hit the stone floor hard, her knee taking the brunt of the impact. The ale splashed over her tunic, freezing against her skin. A sharp silence cut through the immediate vicinity. Cailan, noticing the commotion, stood up. His face twisted in a sneer of deep irritation. "Get her out of here," Cailan barked to one of the guards. "Clumsy fool. This is a royal feast, not a barn." Melissa gritted her teeth, pushing herself up from the floor. Her knee throbbed violently. She didn't look at Cailan. She didn't want him to see the humiliation burning in her chest. Before the guard could take a step toward her, a heavy chair scraped loudly against the stone dais. Gideon Cross stood up. The entire hall fell dead silent. The music ground to a halt. The king walked down the steps of the dais. He didn't look at Cailan. He walked straight to where Melissa was standing, dripping ale onto the floor. He didn't offer her a hand. He knew better than to offer pity to a wolf with her pride. Instead, he looked at the drunken man who had bumped into her. "You drink the king's ale, you keep your feet." Gideon said, his voice low and lethal. "If you cannot manage your liquor, you will spend the night in the snow." The drunken man paled, stammering an apology as he practically folded himself in half, bowing. Gideon turned his attention back to Melissa. He looked at the spreading wet stain on her tunic. "Go to the kitchens. Dry off." Gideon ordered her. It wasn't a request, but underneath the harsh command there was a pragmatic protection. He was giving her an exit. Melissa met his eyes. "Yes, Your Majesty." She turned and limped out of the hall, feeling the heavy weight of the king's gaze on her back until the oak doors swung shut. Up on the dais, Cailan stood frozen, a sudden cold realization beginning to claw at the edges of his mind. The storm broke. 2 days later, a howling blizzard that buried the highlands in 3 feet of snow. The keep became a claustrophobic prison. The extravagant food from the feast dwindled rapidly, and the reality of the poorly stocked winter stores began to bite. Melissa spent her days in the infirmary, an underfunded drafty stone room near the outer walls. She ground willow bark boiled bandages and reorganized the pitifully small supply of medicinal herbs. The pack's actual healer had died in the autumn, and Cailan hadn't bothered to replace him, claiming Beatrice's southern medicines would suffice. They hadn't. It was shortly after midday when the warning bells shattered the muffled silence of the blizzard. The heavy, frantic clanging sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Melissa's veins. She dropped her parcel and ran toward the courtyard. Through the driving snow, a lone horse limped through the gates. Slumped over its neck was one of Cailan's border scouts. The man was covered in blood, his left arm mangled and his face pale with shock. Panic erupted. Men and women shouted, scattering like frightened sheep. Cailan burst from the keep, completely unarmed at his face, a mask of panicked confusion. He stared at the bleeding man, as if the scout were an alien creature. "What happened?" Cailan yelled over the wind. "Who did this?" The scout slid from the saddle, collapsing into the red-stained snow. "Savage, wild clan, 3 miles out. They broke the western barricade. There are dozens of them." "Dozens!" Cailan's voice cracked. He looked around wildly. "Get him inside, bar the gates, where is the king?" Melissa didn't wait for Cailan to give a coherent order. She sprinted to the fallen scout, dropping to her knees in the snow. She tore open the man's heavy cloak, her hands finding the source of the bleeding, a deep, jagged tear in his femoral artery. "Pressure," she yelled at a paralyzed guard standing nearby. "Press down here now." The guard didn't move, dumbfounded by the blood. Melissa cursed violently, pressing her own hands into the wound, leaning her entire body weight into it to stem the arterial spurting. Her hands, already numb from the cold, slipped on the hot, slick blood. Heavy, purposeful footsteps crunched through the snow. Gideon Cross appeared through the blizzard, fully armored, a massive broadsword strapped to his back. His royal guard flanked him, moving with terrifying, silent efficiency. Gideon took one look at the panicked Cailan and dismissed him entirely. He stepped up to the dying scout and Melissa. "He's bleeding out." Melissa grunted, her muscles burning from the exertion. "I can't hold it and bind it at the same time." Gideon didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee beside her in the bloody snow. He didn't care about his armor. He didn't care about the dirt. He plunged his massive gloved hands into the wound, his fingers finding the artery with surgical precision. "I have it," Gideon said, his voice calm and anchor in the storm of panic. "Get your bandages." Melissa scrambled backward, ripping open her satchel. She pulled out a thick wad of boiled linen and a crude iron tourniquet she had fashioned from horse tack. She moved quickly, her hands brushing against Gideon's as she wrapped the linen tight. There was no hesitation between them, no awkwardness. It was the synchronized dance of two people who understood violence and survival. Their shoulders bumped, their breath mingled in the freezing air. "Higher," Gideon instructed quietly. "Above the tear." "I know." Melissa snapped back, pulling the strap brutally tight. Gideon's lips twitched. The faintest ghost of a smirk touched his scarred face. He stepped back, letting her finish the binding. Cailan hovered a few feet away, watching the exchange with a sickening knot forming in his stomach. He saw the way the Alpha King looked at his former mate. He saw the competent, fierce woman he had traded away for a girl who was currently screaming in the keep because the noise of the bells hurt her ears. "Will he live?" Gideon asked Melissa, standing up. Melissa wiped a streak of blood from her cheek. "If he survives the shock, we need to get him inside, get him warm." Gideon nodded to two of his guards, who immediately lifted the scout and carried him toward the infirmary. Then the king turned to Cailan. The calmness vanished. The monster surfaced. 3 miles, Gideon stated softly, dangerously. "They bypassed your ornamental fences, Roe. They are at your throat." "We will barricade the doors," Cailan stammered. "We can hold the keep." "They don't want the keep, you fool," Gideon snarled, grabbing Cailan by the velvet collar of his tunic and lifting him onto his toes. "They want your stores. They want to burn your outer perimeter, slaughter your workers, and freeze you out. If we lock the doors, your people in the lower wards die." Cailan swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Beatrice, who was watching from the safety of the stone steps. I cannot risk the Luna." A disgusted rumble vibrated in Gideon's chest. He shoved Cailan backward, letting the Alpha stumble into the snow. "You are a coward," Gideon pronounced loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "You are not fit to lead wolves." Gideon drew his broadsword. The scrape of steel against leather cut through the howling wind. "My men will hold the gap at the western ridge. We will bottleneck them." Gideon announced to the terrified pack. He turned his slate eyes to Melissa. She was still kneeling in the blood-stained snow, her breath pluming in the air. "You." Gideon pointed the tip of his sword toward her. "What is your name?" "Melissa." She answered, her voice steady. "Can you shoot Melissa? I can put a bolt through a rabbit's eye at 50 yards. Good. Gather anyone who can hold a crossbow. Put them on the lower wall. Shoot anything that isn't wearing my colors." Kaelin stepped forward, outraged. "You cannot commandeer my people. She is a laundress." Gideon turned his head slowly, leveling a look of such absolute murderous intent that Kaelin physically recoiled. "She is the only one in this courtyard who didn't freeze when the blood started flowing," Gideon said coldly. "Now get out of my sight before I decide you are an enemy combatant." The king turned away, rallying his heavy cavalry. The air crackled with his dominating presence. Melissa stood up, her blood-soaked hands trembling, not from fear, but from the raw, vibrating energy of the impending fight. She watched the Alpha King mount his Dystria, a dark warlord riding out to face the storm. For the first time in 3 months, the crushing weight of winter lifted from her chest. She turned and ran towards the armory. Kaelin had made his choice. Now it was time for her to make hers. Iron hinges shrieked as Melissa kicked the armory door open. Inside, the air tasted of stale grease and rusted metal. She ignored the polished ceremonial swords mounted on the walls for Beatrice's aesthetic pleasure. Instead, she bypassed the displays and dragged a heavy oak chest from the back corner. Inside lay a tangled mess of heavy arbalests and iron-tipped quarrels. They were old, heavy, and lethal. Bran limped in right behind her, dragging a burlap sack of bowstrings. Behind him clustered a dozen terrified workers. The baker clutched a meat cleaver. The tanner held a skinning knife with trembling hands. These were the people Kaelin had abandoned to secure the upper keep. Racks of weapons were stripped bare in minutes. Melissa shoved a heavy crossbow into the baker's chest. "Keep your finger off the trigger until you have a target. Wind it with both hands. If your fingers freeze, use your palms." Up on the lower battlements, the wind howled with a vicious, biting ferocity. Visibility was reduced to a few dozen yards of swirling grey and white. Melissa positioned her makeshift militia along the crumbling stone parapet. She kicked away the decorative flower boxes Beatrice had ordered installed last month, clearing space for the shooters to plant their boots. Down in the valley, the gorge narrowed into a natural choke point. That was where the king had chosen to make his stand. Through the blinding white shadows began to materialize. Not wolves in their animal forms, the cold was too brutal to risk the vulnerability of shifting, but massive feral men wrapped in stolen pelts and boiled leather. The wild clans. They moved with a terrifying, chaotic speed, howling over the wind, wielding rusted battle axes and serrated iron clubs. Gideon's vanguard met them like a wall of blackened steel. Clashing metal rang out a dull, heavy sound, quickly swallowed by the snow. Gideon fought like a machine born for slaughter. He didn't waste energy on wide, theatrical swings. He stepped into the enemy's guard, driving his broadsword through leather, flesh, and bone, with brutal, terrifying efficiency. His men moved around him in perfect synchronization, forming an unbreakable phalanx that ground the chaotic, savage charge into a bloody pulp. Melissa braced her boot in the stirrup of her crossbow, hauling the thick bowstring back until it clicked into the firing nut. Her muscles burned. She slammed a heavy iron bolt into the groove, raising the weapon to her shoulder. Squinting through the snowfall, she scanned the periphery of the clash. Gideon's men held the center beautifully, but the wild clan outnumbered them 3-1. Savages began peeling off, scrambling up the icy embankments to flank the royal guard. "Left flank!" Melissa screamed, her voice cracking over the wind. "Aim for the rocks, fire!" Recoil punched her shoulder. The iron bolt snapped through the air, burying itself into the throat of a rogue, climbing the rocks above Gideon's left flank. The man tumbled backward, taking 2 others down with him in an avalanche of loose shale and snow. Beside her, the baker and the tanner unleashed their quarrels. Most missed shattering against the stone gorge, but the sudden rain of iron from the lower walls forced the flanking savages to break cover. Down in the gorge, Gideon glanced up at the battlements. He couldn't see her clearly through the blizzard, but he saw the bolts raining down, effectively shielding his vulnerable side. A sharp, feral grin broke across his scarred face. He turned back to the slaughter with renewed violence. Adrenaline narrowed her vision to a tunnel. Crank load aim fire. Melissa repeated the mechanical process until her fingers bled and her shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. She didn't think about Cailan hiding in his warm hall. She didn't think about Beatrice crying into her silk pillows. She only saw the grey shapes moving toward the men holding the line. One massive rogue, towering a full foot over the rest, broke through the Royal Guard's phalanx. He carried a heavy maul, spinning it with terrifying momentum. He brought it down on the shield of a Royal Guardsman, shattering the wood and driving the man to his knees. The savage raised the maul for a killing blow. Gideon was engaged with two attackers, his back turned to the breach. He couldn't reach his man in time. Melissa didn't have time to crank her heavy arbalest. She dropped it. Snatching a lighter preloaded hunting bow from the frozen hands of a terrified stable boy next to her, she drew the string back to her cheek. Breathing out a slow, steady stream of frosted air, she tracked the massive rogue. Release. The arrow punched precisely through the small gap between the rogue's leather collar and his ear. The massive man froze, the maul slipping from his grip. He collapsed backward into the snow like a felled oak. Gideon spun around, his sword raised only to find the threat already neutralized. He stared at the feathered shaft protruding from the dead man's neck. Slowly he looked back up to the battlements. Through the break in the snow, Melissa met his eyes. She lowered the bow, her chest heaving. The king offered no salute, no grand gesture. He simply gave a single sharp nod of profound respect. Then he turned and finished butchering the rest of the raiding party. Silence returned to the valley at dusk. The blizzard finally broke, leaving behind a sky the color of a bruised plum. Casualties were low among the Royal Guard, a testament to their brutal discipline, but they did not return unscathed. They marched back through the iron gates, exhausted, their armor dented and smeared with freezing gore. The packworkers rushed out to meet them, no longer terrified but carrying blankets, hot broth, and profound gratitude. Melissa washed her hands in a bucket of snowmelt inside the infirmary. The freezing water stung her split knuckles, but it cleared the grime and sweat. She had spent the last hour treating the minor scrapes and sprains of her makeshift wall militia. Heavy leather creaked in the doorway. Gideon ducked through the low archway of the infirmary. He had removed his heavy steel breastplate, wearing only his padded gambeson and a blood-soaked tunic underneath. A deep, ugly gash ran across his left bicep, soaking the thick fabric in dark crimson. Two of Beatrice's pristine southern physicians trailed nervously behind him, carrying a velvet-lined box of silver surgical tools. "Your Majesty, please." One of the physicians begged, wringing his clean hands. "Luna Beatrice insists we treat you in the upper chambers. It is sterile there. We have imported salves." Gideon stopped in the middle of the room. He turned slowly to look at the physician. "Your Luna spent the battle hiding in a cellar. If you touch me with those polished toys, I will make you swallow them." The physicians blanched, backing out of the room entirely and fleeing down the corridor. Gideon turned his attention back to the room. He spotted Melissa standing by the wash basin. He walked over, pulling up a crude wooden stool, and sat down with a heavy groan. "I need stitches," he said simply. Melissa grabbed a clean cloth and a bottle of raw grain alcohol. She didn't curtsy. She didn't coddle him. She walked over and tore the fabric of his sleeve wider to expose the wound. It was deep, a glancing blow from a rusted axe, but it hadn't hit the artery. "It's going to burn," she warned, unstopping the bottle. "Pour it," he commanded. She dumped the harsh alcohol directly into the open gash. Gideon didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking along the scarred side of his face, but he didn't make a sound. Threading a bone needle with thick gut string, Melissa went to work. She stood close to him, forced to brace her hip against his knee for leverage. He radiated immense heat, cutting through the bitter draft of the stone room. Up close, the predatory aura he carried was suffocating a heavy weight that demanded submission. But Melissa didn't submit. She just sewed. "That was a good shot on the wall." Gideon rumbled quietly, his voice vibrating through her fingers where they rested against his arm. "You left your flank exposed," she replied, pulling a stitch tight. "A tactical error." A low, dark chuckle vibrated in his chest. "I prioritized breaking their center. I knew I had a competent archer watching my back." Melissa paused, looking up at him. His slate eyes were entirely focused on her face. There was no arrogance in his stare, only a sharp, intense calculation. "You didn't know I could actually shoot," she pointed out. "I could have been lying. People who lie about their skills don't have hands that look like yours," Gideon said. He reached out with his uninjured arm, wrapping his massive, calloused fingers around her wrist. He gently turned her hand over, tracing the thick calluses on her palms and the scars on her knuckles. "These are the hands of a woman who built a pack, not a woman who washes clothes, for one." Melissa swallowed hard. The casual physical contact sent a jolt of static heat up her arm. Nobody had looked at her hands with anything but disgust or pity for 3 months. Gideon looked at them like they were forged weapons. Before she could pull her hand away, Kaelan barged into the room. He wore a fresh, unstained tunic of dark blue wool. His hair was perfectly combed. He looked like a man arriving at a banquet, not a man whose fortress had just been assaulted. He stopped dead when he saw the king sitting on a cheap wooden stool, bleeding, while Melissa, his discarded, lowly ex-mate, stood practically bracketed between the king's thighs, her hands on his bare skin. Kaelan's face flushed with a sudden possessive anger. It was a stupid, instinctual reaction. He didn't want her anymore, but seeing another alpha claim her space offended his pride. "Your Majesty," Kaelan said, his voice tight. "The feast has been reset in the Great Hall. The Luna and I are waiting to celebrate your victory." Nobody spoke for a long second. Melissa continued stitching the wound, not bothering to look at Kaelan. Gideon didn't even turn his head. He kept his eyes locked on Melissa, watching the steady, precise movement of her hands. "Celebrate," Gideon finally repeated. The word sounded like a curse in his mouth. "The Wild Clan is broken." Kaelan pushed, stepping further into the room. "The threat is neutralized. You saved our home." Gideon finally turned his head. The sheer crushing weight of his alpha presence flooded the small room. Kaelan physically staggered back a step, choking on the sudden pressure in the air. "I saved a strategic choke point." Gideon corrected, his voice dangerously soft. "Your home is a liability. Your workers fought with farming tools while your soldiers hid inside to protect your rich bride. You are a failure of an alpha row." Kaelan's jaw dropped. "My king, I followed protocol. The Luna's safety is irrelevant if the pack starves to death because the workers are slaughtered." Gideon snapped, standing up. Melissa had just snipped the final thread. He towered over Kaelan, bleeding and terrifying. "You traded a wolf for a lapdog, and it has made you weak." Kaelan's eyes darted to Melissa, humiliated and furious. "She is a laundress. She is nothing." Gideon stepped into Kaelan's personal space, forcing the smaller alpha to crane his neck back. "She held the wall while you hid," Gideon whispered. "She stitched my arm while your imported quacks wept in the hallway. If you ever speak of her with disrespect again, I will mount your head on one of those decorative iron spikes you love so much." Kaelan paled, the last remnants of his pride evaporating into pure terror. He backed out of the infirmary, stumbling over the threshold, and fled down the corridor without another word. Gideon watched him go, the contempt radiating off him in waves. He turned back to Melissa. She was wiping the blood off her scissors, her face completely unreadable. "You should have let him have his feast," she said quietly. He'll take his humiliation out on the workers tomorrow. Let him try, Gideon replied, picking up his bloody tunic. He looked at her, his slate eyes softening just a fraction. Pack your things, Melissa. You aren't staying here. Melissa stared at him. The command hung in the damp air of the infirmary, heavy and absolute. Kings did not make suggestions. They issued edicts. Yet as she wiped the remaining alcohol from the wooden table, a stubborn heat flared in her chest. She had spent 10 years building a life out of frozen mud, only to have it ripped away by a man she trusted. She would not simply hand the reins of her fate over to another, even if he wore a crown. I am not a sack of grain to be requisitioned, Your Majesty, she said, tossing the bloodied rag into a bucket. Kaelin may have discarded me, but I am still a wolf of the Northern Reach. I don't belong in a southern court. Gideon paused by the doorway. He didn't look angry. If anything, the harsh lines around his mouth softened into something resembling grim approval. A southern court would eat you alive, Melissa, and you would likely burn it down on your way out. I am not taking you to the capital to wear silk and sip sweet wine. Then why? Because my northern garrison is currently commanded by a man who values decorative ironwork over spiked barricades. Gideon stated plainly, his slate eyes locking onto hers. I am stripping Kaelin of his military oversight. He will retain his title, but he will no longer control the border defenses or the armory. I need a warden who understands this terrain. Someone who knows the wild clans. Someone who doesn't flinch when a severed artery paints the snow. He wasn't offering her a rescue. He was offering her a war, a brutal, thankless job on the edge of the civilized territories. Melissa looked down at her hands. They were ruined for high society, but perfectly suited for holding a line. She looked back up at the Alpha King. You want me to take command of his border patrols? I want you to rebuild them, Gideon corrected. You built this pack once. You can build a garrison. Pack your things. He turned and walked out into the corridor, leaving no room for further argument. Dawn broke over the highlands, with a vicious pale light. The blizzard had passed, leaving the courtyard buried under heavy drifts. Melissa stood by the stables, a single canvas rucksack slung over her shoulder. It contained 2 spare tunics, a hunting knife, and the thick wool blanket she had slept under for the past 3 months. It was a pathetic accumulation for a decade of labor, but she refused to take anything Kaelin had bought with Beatrice's silver. Across the courtyard, the royal vanguard mounted their massive destriers. Their armor clanked sharply in the frigid air. Gideon sat atop his roan, his injured arm resting easily on the pommel of his saddle. He looked entirely unaffected by the previous day's slaughter. Kaelin stood on the stone steps of the keep, flanked by 2 of his personal guards. Beatrice was nowhere to be seen, likely still huddled beneath layers of imported fur. Kaelin's face was a mask of pale, strained courtesy. He was losing his military authority, but more importantly, he was losing face in front of his entire pack. The workers who had fought alongside Melissa on the wall were gathered near the gates. They weren't cheering. They were watching in sullen resentment as their actual leader prepared to ride away. You are making a mistake, Your Majesty, Kaelin called out, unable to keep the bitter edge from his voice. She has no formal training. She is a peasant. Gideon didn't even turn his head to look at him. He adjusted the leather reins in his right hand. Your definition of a peasant is a woman who held your walls while you cowered in a cellar. My definition of a peasant is a man who lets his people fight with farming tools. Kaelin flushed a mottled red, his jaw clenching so hard it looked painful. A heavy dark grey mare was led out of the stables by one of the royal guards. It wasn't a palfrey meant for a lady. It was a sturdy, thick-boned war-horse built for endurance and rough terrain. The guard handed the reins to Melissa with a respectful nod. Melissa secured her rucksack behind the saddle. She didn't look at Kaelin. She didn't need to see his jealousy or his regret. He was a closed chapter, a hollowed-out memory that no longer held any power over her. She swung herself up into the saddle, settling her boots into the iron stirrups. Gideon raised a gauntleted hand. The heavy iron gates of the northern reach groaned open, scraping against the packed snow. "Move out," the king ordered. The vanguard surged forward. Melissa spurred her mare, falling into line just behind Gideon's massive roan. As they passed through the gates, Bran stepped out from the crowd of workers. The old one-eared warrior didn't speak. He simply crossed his right arm over his chest and bowed his head, a deep traditional salute meant only for an alpha. One by one, the bakers, the tanners, and the laundresses followed suit. Melissa felt a hard lump form in her throat. She returned the salute, pressing her fist to her chest before riding out into the blinding white of the Highland Pass. She was leaving the only home she had ever known, but for the first time in months she wasn't freezing. 3 days of relentless riding separated the northern reach from the primary military encampment in the Central Valley. The journey was punishing. The temperature hovered dangerously low, and the snowdrifts concealed treacherous ravines. This was where Cailan would have ordered a halt. He would have complained about the damp seeping into his boots and demanded they set up pavilions with brazier fires. Gideon Cross did not halt. He rode at the head of the column, a silent, imposing monolith against the grey sky. His men followed his pace without a single word of complaint. They ate dried, salted meat in the saddle and slept in short tactical shifts when the horses absolutely required rest. Melissa kept up. Her thighs burned and her lower back ached with a deep, grinding pain, but she never asked for a slower pace. She managed her mare, efficiently reading the terrain, anticipating the icy patches that could snap a horse's leg. She noticed the royal guards watching her, their initial skepticism slowly melting into a quiet, professional respect. She wasn't slowing them down. In this brutal world, that was the highest form of praise. On the third night, they made camp in the ruins of an old watchtower. The crumbling stone walls offered a meager windbreak against the howling gales. Small, smokeless fires were built from dry brush to avoid signaling their position to any lingering rogue elements. Melissa sat near a fire, unwrapping a stiff piece of salted venison. She used her hunting knife to hack off a manageable bite, chewing the tough meat systematically. Her hands were blistered from the rains, the leather gloves she wore offering little protection against the friction and the cold. Heavy footsteps crunched on the loose gravel behind her. Gideon stepped into the dim circle of firelight. He wasn't wearing his armor, just a thick wool tunic and heavily worn leather trousers. He carried a small tin cup in his uninjured hand. He didn't ask for permission to sit. He dropped down onto a chunk of fallen masonry across from her, resting his elbows on his knees. He held the tin cup out toward her. "Drink," he commanded softly. Melissa took the cup. The metal was warm. She brought it to her lips and swallowed. It wasn't ale. It was a harsh, bitter tea brewed from pine needles and white willow bark, a natural remedy for inflammation and muscle pain. It tasted like dirt, but the heat spread through her chest, instantly easing the tight ache in her shoulders. "Thank you," she rasped, handing the cup back. Gideon set it on a flat stone between them. He watched her for a long moment, the flickering firelight casting deep, shifting shadows over his scarred face. In the dark, he looked less like a king and more like a hardened mercenary who had simply outlived all his enemies. "You haven't complained once." Gideon observed his voice a low rumble that blended with the wind. Most wolves would be begging for a bed by now. Complaining burns calories. Melissa replied, flatly. "And it doesn't change the weather." A faint, genuine smile touched the corner of his mouth. It was a rare expression, one that completely transformed his face, making him look startlingly human. Pragmatism. A rare trait. Cailan preferred optics. Melissa looked down at her battered boots. Cailan preferred whatever was easiest. Building a pack was hard. Marrying a rich girl who brought an army of enforcers and a lifetime supply of grain was easy. I don't blame him for wanting to survive. "Don't lie to me, Melissa, and don't lie to yourself." Gideon's voice hardened slightly, losing the conversational tone. "You blame him. You should. He traded loyalty for convenience. In my lands, that is a capital offence. Melissa looked up, meeting his intense slate gaze. And what do you trade for your majesty or competence? Gideon answered immediately. I trade for people who don't break when the world leans on them. I don't care about bloodlines. I don't care about dowries. I care about who can hold the line when the dark comes. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. The sheer size of him was overwhelming, but Melissa didn't pull back. The scent of ozone leather and sharp pine filled her senses. He made you feel like you were disposable because you didn't wear silk. Gideon said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He was a fool. Silk tears on the first branch it catches, leather holds. He reached across the small fire, his large fingers gently grasping her chin. His thumb brushed over a small smear of soot on her cheek. The touch was entirely devoid of Kaelin's usual possessive grip. It was deliberate grounding and shockingly gentle for a man who made his living with a broadsword. You are going to rebuild my northern garrison, Gideon told her, his eyes locked on hers. You are going to train my border patrols, and when Kaelin Rowe finally realizes that his ornamental gates cannot stop the things that live in the deep woods, he is going to have to come begging to you for protection. Melissa felt a dark, satisfying thrill coil in her stomach. It wasn't just vengeance. It was justice. Gideon released her chin and stood up, his massive frame blocking out the bitter wind. Get some sleep, Melissa. Tomorrow we reach the garrison. The real work begins. He walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the ruined tower. Melissa sat by the dying fire, the taste of bitter tea still on her tongue. Her muscles screamed, her knuckles bled, and she was miles away from everything she knew. But as she laid her wool blanket over the hard, frozen ground, she felt an absolute, unshakable certainty. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Mud replaced the pristine snow as they descended into the central valley, a vast, freezing basin, heavily fortified by raw timber and black stone. Fort Brennan was an ugly utilitarian scar on the landscape. It did not boast painted banners or velvet-draped halls. It smelled of wood-smoke, wet dogs, and grinding steel. This was the beating heart of Gideon's military machine. 800 seasoned warriors operated within its walls. These were men and women who had spent their lives holding back the darkest terrors of the northern woods. They were lethal, scarred, and deeply suspicious of outsiders. When Gideon rode through the heavy portcullis with Melissa flanking him, the sprawling courtyard fell entirely silent. Sentries paused their patrols. Blacksmiths lowered their hammers. 800 pairs of eyes locked onto the exhausted woman riding the heavy warhorse beside their warlord. Gideon did not call an assembly. He did not make a grand, booming speech demanding their respect. Kings who had to demand respect rarely kept their crowns. Instead, he led Melissa directly to the command pavilion, a massive canvas structure pitched in the center of the yard. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and burning tallow. 3 commanders leaned over a sprawling map of the Northern Territories. They straightened as Gideon entered, saluting by slamming their fists against their leather-clad chests. "My king." The eldest commander, a giant of a man with a braided grey beard named Corlys, rumbled. His eyes shifted immediately to Melissa, narrowing with unconcealed disdain. "We were not informed you were bringing camp followers. The barracks are full." Melissa didn't flinch. She simply looked at Corlys, cataloguing his heavy stance, the worn grip of his broadsword, and the arrogant tilt of his chin. Gideon walked to the map table, stripping off his heavy leather gauntlets. He tossed them onto the parchment. "She is not a camp follower, Corlys. She is your new warden of the Northern Reach. You will hand over the patrol rosters, the armory keys, and the tactical logs to her immediately." Silence slammed into the tent like a physical weight. Corlys stared at Gideon, then at Melissa, his face flushing with insulted outrage. "Your Majesty, you jest. This is a peasant woman. I know of her Kaelin Rowe's discarded bedmate. She washes tunics. You expect me to hand command of 800 killers to a laundress? I expect you to obey my orders, Corlys, or I expect you to surrender your sword and walk out those gates." Gideon replied. His voice never rose above a quiet conversational tone, but the lethal promise beneath it made the ambient temperature in the tent plummet. Corliss's jaw ticked. He was a proud man, a veteran. Submitting to a political appointee was one thing. Submitting to a disgraced ex-mate was an insult he couldn't swallow. "With respect, sire." Corliss growled, stepping away from the table. "I have held this valley for 15 years. She doesn't know the terrain. She doesn't know the men. She will get our patrols slaughtered." Gideon opened his mouth to end the man's career, but Melissa stepped forward. She bypassed Gideon entirely, walking up to the heavy oak table. She looked down at the sprawling, detailed map of the Highlands. It was meticulously drawn, noting every elevation change, every river crossing, and every known savage encampment. "You lost a scouting party 3 weeks ago on the jagged ridge near the Blackwater Gorge." Melissa stated, her voice calm and remarkably steady. Corliss frowned, caught off guard. "Yes, an ambush. The wild clans had the high ground." "They didn't have the high ground," Melissa corrected, picking up a piece of charcoal and leaning over the map. She drew a harsh black line straight through Corliss's marked patrol route. "They used the old smuggler's tunnel beneath the limestone shelf. It empties out directly behind this pass. Your men weren't ambushed from above. They were flanked from below. I know because I spent 4 winters mapping those caves while Cailan was busy attending banquets in the south." Corliss stared at the black line, his tactical mind warring with his pride. "Those tunnels collapsed 5 years ago." The main artery collapsed. The secondary vents are still clear. They just require you to crawl on your belly through freezing mud for a mile. Melissa tossed the charcoal back onto the table. She looked up, meeting the veteran commander's eyes with a flat, unflinching stare. "Your men are walking blind into a choke point because you are relying on outdated maps. If you want to keep them alive, you will hand me the rosters, now." Corliss looked at the map, then at Melissa. The disdain in his eyes slowly begrudgingly morphed into something resembling cautious assessment. He was a soldier first. He recognized competence when it slapped him in the face. He didn't apologize. He simply reached into his heavy leather coat, pulled out an iron ring, heavy with keys, and tossed it onto the map. It landed with a heavy clatter directly over the Blackwater Gorge. "Revel is at dawn, Warden." Corliss grunted, stepping back into line. Melissa picked up the keys. They felt heavy, cold, and entirely right in her palm. Over the next 4 months, Melissa systematically dismantled and rebuilt the northern defenses. She did not lead from the command tent. She led from the mud. She stood in the freezing rain drilling the infantry until their lungs burned. She rode out with the deep woods patrols, sleeping on the frozen ground and tracking rogue movements through the dense, unforgiving timber. She stripped the ornamental bullshit from the garrison. She rationed the grain, reinforced the palisades with sharpened ironwood, and replaced the bulky ceremonial armor with boiled leather that allowed the soldiers to actually move in combat. She bled with them. She froze with them. And by the time the first signs of the spring thaw began to melt the highland snows, the men of Fort Brennan did not follow her because the king commanded it. They followed her because she was ruthless, brilliant, and kept them alive. Gideon watched it all. He stayed at the garrison claiming it was a necessary tactical oversight, but his royal guard knew better. The Alpha King, a man who had trusted no one in his entire brutal reign, was fascinated by the weapon he had unleashed. They spent their evenings in the war room drinking bitter tea, debating logistics, and mapping the extermination of the wild clans. There was no romance in the traditional sense. There were no sonnets or stolen kisses. There was only the quiet, profound intimacy of 2 apex predators recognizing an equal. Heavy spring rains turned the valley into a treacherous mire. The war room of Fort Brennan was humid, smelling of damp wool and hot wax. Melissa stood over the tactical table dressed in the heavy, dark leather of the warden, a thick dire wolf pelt draped across her shoulders. The heavy canvas flaps of the tent were thrown open. A royal guard stepped inside his armor, dripping water onto the floorboards. "Your Majesty?" Warden. The guard saluted. A rider has arrived from the Upper Highlands. It is Alpha Rowe. He requests an immediate audience. Melissa didn't look up from the map. Beside her, Gideon paused mid-sentence, his slate eyes darkening into a storm front. Bring him, Gideon commanded. Moments later, Cailan stumbled into the tent. He was unrecognizable. The velvet doublets and perfectly combed hair were gone. His clothes were torn and caked in grey mud. His face was gaunt, unshaven, and twisted in a mask of absolute hollow panic. He looked like a man who had finally realized the world did not care about his title. He fell to his knees the moment he saw Gideon. My king! Cailan gasped, his voice cracking. He pressed his forehead to the wet floorboards. I beg of you. You must send the army. The wild clans. They have unified. 4 tribes. They breached the western ridge. They are slaughtering everyone. Gideon stood perfectly still, a monument of dark, unyielding stone. He looked down at the groveling Alpha. And where is your army, Rowe? Where are the elite enforcers your rich bride brought to your bed? Cailan squeezed his eyes shut, a pathetic sob catching in his throat. They fled. When the barricades fell, her father's men took the fastest horses and abandoned the keep. Beatrice went with them. They left us to die. His ornamental ironwork had failed. His bought loyalty had evaporated. He was left with nothing but the consequences of his own cowardice. They have surrounded the lower wards. Cailan pleaded, looking up, his eyes wild and desperate. The workers are trapped in the cellars. We have no food. We have no weapons. If you do not ride north today, the entire pack will be butchered. I am the king of the unified territories, Rowe, Gideon said softly, his voice echoing in the quiet tent. I do not command the northern border patrols. Gideon took a deliberate step backward, sweeping his arm toward the opposite side of the tactical table. You will address the Warden of the North. Cailan turned his head. Through his panic-blurred vision, he finally looked at the commander standing in the shadows of the tent. He saw the heavy leather armor. He saw the dire wolf pelt. And then he saw the face. All the blood drained from Cailan's face. His jaw went entirely slack. Melissa stared back at him. There was no triumph in her eyes. There was no vindictive glee. There was only the cold, flat calculation of a commander assessing a liability. Melissa. Cailan whispered the name, slipping from his lips like a dying breath. Stand up, Cailan, Melissa ordered. Her voice lacked any of the warmth it once held for him. It was sharp iron. You are embarrassing yourself in front of my men. Cailan tried to stand, but his legs trembled violently. He grabbed the edge of the tactical table, pulling himself up, his eyes locked on her in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The laundress he had discarded was standing before him as the most powerful military commander in the Northern Hemisphere. Melissa, please! He choked out the reality of his situation, crushing the last remnants of his pride. They are burning the Lower Bailey. Bran is trapped in the armory. The children... At the mention of Bran, a muscle ticked in Melissa's jaw. The old one-eared warrior had been the only one to show her kindness. The workers in those cellars were the people she had bled for. They were innocent of Cailan's stupidity. Melissa turned her back on Cailan, looking at Commander Corliss, who was standing quietly near the entrance. Sound the horns! Melissa commanded, her voice ringing with absolute authority. I want the heavy cavalry mounted in 10 minutes. Prepare the Iron Storm crossbows. We march on the northern reach. Corliss slammed his fist to his chest. Yes, Warden. He spun on his heel and rushed out into the rain. Cailan sagged against the table, a ragged sigh of relief escaping his lips. Thank you. Melissa. Thank you. I swear when we reclaim the keep, things will be different. I will make you... You will make me nothing. Melissa interrupted, cutting him off with a surgical brutality. She walked around the table, stopping inches from his face. Cailan shrank back from the sheer, overwhelming pressure of her presence. I am not riding north for you, Cailan. I am riding north for my people. When the slaughter is done, you will surrender your Alpha title to the crown. You will leave the territories and you will never set foot in the Highlands again. If I ever see your face after today, I will string you up by your own ornamental gates." Kaelin stared at her, utterly broken. He had traded a diamond for glass, and the glass had shattered the moment the wind blew. He nodded once, a pathetic, jerky motion, and stumbled out of the tent into the mud. The heavy war horns blew a terrifying, guttural sound that rattled the wooden beams of the pavilion. Gideon walked up behind Melissa. He reached out his large, calloused hand resting heavily on her shoulder. The warmth of his touch seeped through the thick leather of her armor, grounding her. "Are you ready to take your home back, Warden?" Gideon asked quietly. Melissa looked out the tent flaps, watching the 800 killers she commanded mount their destriers in the pouring rain. They were organized lethal and ready to bring absolute ruin to the wild clans. She turned her head, meeting Gideon's slate eyes. She saw the fierce, uncompromising pride shining there. He hadn't saved her. He had simply handed her a sword and watched her conquer the world herself. "It was never his keep, Gideon." Melissa said, a small, dark smile finally touching her lips. "It was always mine. Now let's go remind the wild clans who owns the North." They walked out into the storm together, not as a king and his subject, but as an alpha and his equal ready to burn the encroaching darkness to ash. Betrayal cuts deep, but surviving it forges iron. Melissa's journey from a discarded, heartbroken mate to the ruthless warden of the North proves that true power isn't handed down through political marriages or inherited titles. It is earned in the mud, in the cold, and in the refusal to break. Kaelin traded loyalty for luxury and lost everything, while Gideon recognized the lethal brilliance of the woman standing in the ashes. If you loved this gritty tale of vengeance, survival, and hard-earned respect, please hit the like button, share it with your pack, and subscribe for more epic storytelling.